Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, where we'll be talking about how do we defend our Christian faith in an increasingly secular era. And in today's programme, I'm joined by Robert Harris, who is the Strategic Director for Voice for Justice in the UK, together with Tim Dieppe, who's Head of Public Policy at Christian Concern. Tim, it's been a big week in British politics. Last week we had the local elections, first time we've had a local election since 2019. Huge losses for the Conservative Party.
Yes.
We've had King Charles III's coronation.
Yes.
But because I've got two Christian heavyweights on the programme, the front line in defending Christian freedoms in the UK, we have to talk about Christian freedom and freedom of speech. So if you can give us an update on the wonderful ministry that is Christian Concern and the great job you guys are all doing to defend our Christian freedoms and values in this country.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's great to be with you. And yeah, there's a lot going on in the nation at the moment, as you rightly said, big events and lots of politics as well. And quite a lot going on in the life of Christian Concern as well. And we've had a number of important legal cases come through in the last few months or so. Some street preachers, some other employees, a chaplain, various people who have lost their jobs or been arrested for what they believe or for manifesting their Christian views. Yeah, they're getting quite a lot of attention and a lot of media traction, and quite often we're winning in these cases as well, which is very encouraging.
No, definitely. We'll keep winning because we need you to keep winning. And Robert, it's great to have you back on the programme. You did a great job last time with Linda. Can you just also describe, really, give us an update on your latest campaign, which according to my notes is when end-of-life care goes wrong, because it's so important that at the end of people's life, the care they're given is they're allowed to die with dignity and help.
Thanks for having me back on the programme, Simon.
Pleasure.
Yes, the report, when end-of-life care goes wrong, it was sent out to every member of Parliament. We're in the process of getting a meeting, trying to get a meeting with the Secretary of State for Health. We've had a few very positive responses from MPs, but we don't want this to just gather dust on the bookshelf. We want this report to actually have impact. We've heard from people, individuals, who are experiencing problems in their family with their father or their mother in hospital. So if you are listening, and if anyone's listening and you've got a member of your family who is going through these problems right now, or perhaps went through these problems recently, there is a Facebook group which a lady called Denise Charlesworth-Smith heads up. She helped us to produce the report, and her own father died on the Liverpool Care Pathway. Contact Voice for Justice UK and we will put you in touch with that group. It's a support group on Facebook.
Wonderful. And Tim, Christian Concern, together with Voice for Justice UK, you guys really are on the front line in defending Christian freedoms and freedom of speech as well. So share with us the extent of the battle that we face in this country as we increasingly go down a very secular path.
Yeah, so I think it is quite shocking, really, isn't it? We just had a coronation with lots of Christian symbolism and Christian words in it, and yet, I know I was talking about, preserve the gospel and all that, and yet people for sharing the gospel, for preaching Christianity, for expressing their Christian beliefs are losing their jobs and being arrested and suffering for it. And this is the first steps of persecution. If you lose your livelihood for your faith, that is a kind of persecution effectively. And so we've gone a long way from being a Christian nation in this country. And it's kind of extraordinary that a chap who was preaching on the streets, was arrested and convicted, fined, given community service for the crime of misgendering, so-called. And I'm very pleased to say we got that conviction overturned, and he's now cleared from that. And various other people losing their jobs. A chaplain in a school preached a sermon in chapel as a chaplain in a Church of England school that you should be free to disagree with LGBT or other ideologies. He didn't say they were wrong. He just said you should be free to disagree with it, make your own mind up. And he lost his job for that as a chaplain preaching a Christian message in a Christian service in a Christian school. And so these are real issues, real problems, I think, that Christians are facing in the workplace and street preachers as well. But I'm pleased to say we're quite often winning. I think we've got now 60 street preacher cases that we've helped over 10 years plus, and every single one of them we've got them cleared and of any charges or charges dropped there, because our laws do protect freedom of speech. It's just the police aren't protecting free speech, they're arresting people.
Yeah, well done for doing that. So important. And Robert, your organisation or ministry, Voice for Justice UK, very much on the front line in wanting to influence our members of Parliament in both houses, both in the House of Commons, but also in the Lords as well. Have you noticed an increasing hostility towards the Christian message amongst our elected members of Parliament and our government?
Sadly, the answer, I think, is yes. There are some members of Parliament who are Christians and they are happy in Parliament, in the public square, to stand up for Christian values. But there are others who, despite being Christians, are actually afraid of speaking out publicly. There's a certain member of Parliament I won't name. He was chairing a meeting which I attended, and he actually said to us that when matters relating to LGBT and legislation comes before Parliament, a number of his colleagues who are traditional-minded Christians will vote against the traditional understanding of sexuality and go with the government or the narrative of the day, because they are afraid of the backlash that could follow from doing something that's not very popular. So it's worrying that you have people who are genuinely aligned with the Christian faith, but politically they are actually afraid of doing, quote unquote, the wrong thing.
Yeah. And Tim, maybe you can give us a bit more insight in terms of the threat to Christian freedom of speech, especially in the kind of workplace, as we're seeing, particularly for those who actually work in the public sector. If they declare their faith in Jesus Christ or they stand on biblical issues, then sometimes we find in so many cases they're just instantly dismissed, or praying with a colleague at work or wearing a cross. Share to the extent how actually the workplace has actually became the
that's another victory that we had this year, actually. A nurse who lost her job for just wearing quite a small cross necklace. It was a confirmation cross necklace, and she'd worn it for like 20 years in the job, and then one day their staff started objecting, saying you can't wear that, it's a religious symbol, and or it's a health and safety risk. Well, they wear these great big lanyards that are much, that, if anything, a safety risk, that ought to be a safety risk rather than a tiny little cross like this. Anyway, she lost her job, but we did win a case for wrongful dismissal in the employment tribunal, and so there's a little victory there that you have the right to wear a cross as a nurse, as you should. And we had a similar case with a chaplain, actually, in a hospice, who wore a lapel badge kind of thing, little cross, 1-inch cross, and he'd worn it for quite a number of years, and then suddenly some people started objecting to it, and he was told this is offensive and you can't wear this. And in this case, he didn't lose his job. We helped him write a letter to the authorities there, and when it got to the senior leadership of Mary Stopes, they said, Mary Curry, sorry, they said, no, of course you can wear a cross, don't be silly. But if we hadn't done that, then this would have happened. And it's kind of extraordinary things that are happening. I mean, those are sort of NHS-related issues. Another NHS-related case is a Catholic chaplain called Patrick Pulicino, and a patient specifically asked to speak to a Catholic chaplain, and then asked him about his own same-sex relationship and what he thought of it. And Patrick said, well, I'm a Catholic and I think the marriage is between a man and a woman, as you'd expect a Catholic to say. And this patient reported him, and he was disciplined. And they said to him that equality and diversity takes precedence over religious freedom, which is wrong. That's not how it should be. And again, we took that one to court, and they ended up deciding, yes, okay, that we were wrong to do that.
So do you find there's a lot of cases with entrapment? That many Christians, because they are forthright in their biblical beliefs, they want to share the faith and the...
Well, that case does look like it was entrapment, doesn't it? Most of them are not entrapment. If you're wearing a cross, you're not being trapped, you're doing it, kind of thing. Most of them are not entrapment particularly, but at the same time you're creating difficulties in different ways, and quite a lot of it as well is people expressing their views, like teachers saying, I don't really agree with some of this sex education, which is a common viewpoint held by many people around the country. 100,000 people signed a petition objecting to some sex education stuff a few years back, and yet a pastoral assistant lost her job for posting on Facebook, I have concerns about, widely shared concerns about sex education. Now that's a real free speech issue. It's not entrapment, but it's kind of like the idea is that people seem to believe you must believe these kind of views, otherwise you should be barred from employment. I mean, it should be a bar to employment, not agreeing with these various ideologies, and that surely can't be right for a free society, and we're trying to fight it and push back on it as much as we can.
Absolutely. And Robert, would you say in many cases when it comes to the extreme progressive left that they want everyone to not only embrace their agenda, but totally love their agenda and celebrate their agenda, and they're willing to entrap Christians in getting cancelled for their jobs, in being dismissed from their workplace, and to actually cancel them. And we know the damaging financial impact that that'll have on so many people, knowing that they've made a stand for God in their workplace and they're asked a particular question regarding gender or their sexuality, and however they respond to that will mean whether they face an instant dismissal or being dismissed from their jobs because the authorities want to bow down to these progressive liberals.
Well, as Tim rightly said, it's not always about entrapment. Sometimes it is. But primarily, the issue is freedom. Do we have freedom for everybody or only certain groups? And in a democratic society, freedom is everyone's right. Now, there are limits. People cannot just do what they want. There are limits because my freedom will impinge upon someone else's freedom, potentially. But we're talking about freedoms that don't impinge upon other people's rights, if done respectfully, people expressing their views on the Bible. And in a free society, that should not be penalised. In the same way that someone who is an atheist, they have their rights to speak freely. Someone who is Christian, they have equal rights. And in a society where the Christian traditional narrative is being marginalised, even demonised in some cases, this is very, very worrying, and it's actually telling us that there's a totalitarian extremist narrative that is developing in a society that once held tolerance very high as a standard by which everyone should live and respect each other. But I think we're getting this replacement of what they're calling inclusion. So inclusion is replacing tolerance. They don't mean the same thing.
Very good. And Tim, do you also find that as well, with the cases and the work you do at Christian Concern, that we're increasingly seeing this growing hostility against Christians, whether it's in the media, whether it's the social media giants and platforms, whether it's in Parliament or whether it's in the workplace? As Christians, how do we fight against this seems to be inevitable tide of progressive liberalism that only accepts their own ideology and refuses to accept any other beliefs or any other religious systems?
Yes, well, I think there is increasing intolerance of Christian perspectives, Christians expressing their faith, Christians expressing what the Bible says or what the Christian teaching is, and that's manifested obviously in the many, many cases that we've seen, and people losing their jobs and people being disciplined and so on for expressing so-called dissenting viewpoints from the cultural mainstream. And I think that is an issue. But I think that you're right. We have to speak up about it. We have to not be afraid, not be ashamed of our faith. After all, it is the truth. The truth is what will set people free, and it is what people need to hear. And we have to be unashamed of Jesus and his words, is what he said. And so I think we have to do that, and people need to see that, because I think sometimes a lot of people live in a bubble. They think everyone agrees with this. Because that's the bubble they're in, and that's what the media presents to them and so on. But actually it's not true. There is a very significant number of people who disagree with a lot of this ideology, and we just need to be vocal and say it and express it and not be ashamed and not be afraid to do so. And I have to say, every single one of our clients has not regretted what happened to them. They felt like they obeyed their conscience, they followed what God did, what God wanted them to do, and they've experienced God's blessing and God's presence and God's life, and often God moves them on and promotes them for having stood up in some way, in this kind of way. And so many of them are very delighted to have been given the opportunity to express their faith and stand for it.
Excellent. That's really encouraging to hear that, Tim. And Robert, can you just share with us some examples of how the government is legislating against Christian freedoms and freedom of speech and the right to share the gospel with work colleagues, particularly in the workplace?
Let's first begin with one of the facts, which actually is a positive thing. A lot of the laws in this country regarding freedom is actually on our side. In fact, it's on everyone's side, regardless of what beliefs people have. People are free to speak. That's one of the great things about this country. The way those laws are understood and applied and interpreted, that's where you start to get problems. But in terms of actual legislation, well, the Public Order Act, 2023 was recently passed. And there's a section within that act that specifically deals with the so-called buffer zones outside abortion clinics and what can be done and what can't be done. Now, the word prayer doesn't actually feature in the legislation, but any activity that is deemed to, quote unquote, interfere with a woman's right to access the facility would be deemed to be an offence. So this, although it's a Christian issue, actually there are people who go into those abortion clinics who don't want the abortion. Some do, but some don't. Not all of them are Christian. I've actually spoken to some of them personally, and they didn't want the abortion. They wanted help. They wanted financial help. They wanted emotional help. And some of them were given the blessing of financial help from the people who were offering it to them outside the clinic, and they took that help. They had their child, and they have not regretted it. So there are many people out there, not just Christian people, who want that help, but the country is not providing it. The NHS is not providing it.
It's extraordinary. And Tim, can you also share with us how in this post kind of COVID-19 world, moving on from the pandemic, that we're seeing increasing hostility against Christians. We're seeing an increasing lack of tolerance in our society to each other. And it's almost as if what Paul was saying in Timothy, that the end days will be marked by the hardening of hearts, that people's hearts will grow cold. Do you think this is the times in which we're living in, and this is being reflected in society that we're seeing today?
Yeah, well, I think that definitely that is kind of happening, and I think that the whole COVID-19 thing accelerated a number of trends in this country, including increasing polarisation, increased massive authoritarianism from the government about what you could do, what you can't do, which astonishingly most of the population seem to accept and go along with, but also kind of targeting Christian worship. You weren't bicycle shops could open, off licenses could open, churches could not open. Oh, but you could if you want to do a food bank, but just not if you want to pray in the food bank.
Or a garden centre.
Or worship, or a garden centre as well. And yeah, I'm very pleased to say we brought a case against that, of course, and won. That was just to be illegal what the government did there in closing churches for freedom of religion basis. So yes, I mean, I think it has changed the culture, and it has made us more willing to accept an authoritarian kind of government as a culture, very sadly. And I think it has accelerated various trends across the nation, yes.
Yeah. Robert, how do you believe that Christian freedom of speech that underpins everything is being so viciously attacked in our secular era, from street preachers to defending biblical view on marriage, to standing up for the unborn, praying outside abortion clinics, allowing Christian parents to have rights, and they're being sidelined in schools, as we see that this liberal progressive agenda is trampling upon everything that's essentially sacred?
It's becoming an increasingly urgent issue. These were once freedoms that were considered to be everyone's freedom. Yeah. For instance, in the school context, parents had an automatic right until a few years ago to withdraw their child from sex education classes, right? That is no longer an automatic right. It's a right to request withdrawal. So before you didn't have to give a reason and say, I'm Christian or I'm this and I'm that. You had that automatic right. It was given to you. Now it's a right to request, and the head teacher has the right to overrule your request. Of course, they are understood not to do that very loosely, but still there is a shift taking place. And also, on all these matters that you just spoke about, I think there's a significant move away from the freedom, the tolerance, the right of everyone to express themselves without fear of investigation, without fear of arrest, without fear of disciplinary action. No one should have to face the fear of being disciplined at work or investigated by the police for merely speaking about their faith.
Absolutely. And Tim, we know that Christian freedoms and beliefs are particularly coming under massive attack in this country. But isn't there a kind of danger as our Christian faith is attacked and undermined, so too is democracy and the democratic institutions that underpin our very liberty and freedom are also at stake. So what the Christians may be in the firing line now, but the rest of society will follow if Christians don't speak up and defend our Christian faith and speak out on these big moral, social issues of the day. Surely the church can't afford to be silent any longer.
Well, I do agree with you, Simon, and I think, as again we sort of saw in the coronation, Christianity has been the foundation for our democracy and for our freedoms, and that the people who worded that oath centuries ago wanted it to be absolutely said for centuries ever afterwards in every coronation that you've got to defend gospel freedoms. And you know, the Bible is the most valuable thing in the world. You've got all the crown jewels there, but forget that, the Bible is the most valuable thing there. And it is the gospel that preserves freedom for people and gives the moral basis for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and all these various freedoms and opportunities for people. And as we abandon our Christian heritage, our Christian worldview, then we're abandoning a moral foundation for society, and that is very dangerous and very significant for society, and we could see the collapse of these various values. And it is, I think those two are linked, very much linked, and non-Christians will recognise that as well, that we used to accept Christianity and now we don't, and we're not sure what we accept now, and consequently we have a lack of moral foundation in society, and that the trend then will be towards intolerance and authoritarianism, sadly.
Robert, do we need to learn something and rediscover something from the American author Eric Metaxas and his new book, A Letter to America, which I think is a fantastic book, in which he talks about how the church needs to rediscover its role of being the conscience of the nation. And sadly, we've seen, certainly since the end of the Second World War, going into the 50s and 60s, the church pretty much being silent on some of the major political, social issues of the day. And now we're seeing the impact of that lack of church involvement within our society, that we've effectively now been taken over, and we're now living in a secular post-Christian era.
That's such an important question, Simon. It brings up so many important questions alongside it. I think if the church isn't the conscience of the nation, what is there? What else is there? You have many competing interest groups with all their ideological perspectives, all trying to rule the narrative. I think sadly in this country, although there are many denominations, and if you start with the Church of England as the national church, which it still is in law, sadly, and I'm only speaking about the hierarchy here, not the average person who goes to church on a Sunday and the wider Anglican community, and that's something else. But the Church of England is not really, at the moment, the conscience of the nation. I don't see any evidence of it personally. I mean, where you have a church that has effectively redefined sin in all but words, and you then ask, well, where does grace come into all of that? Where does divine, will and judgment come into all of that? I think the church, in terms of all the denominations, it's not one specific denomination. They need to be the conscience of the nation, and when they don't stand up for what is right, and they just, stand behind their walls and pray on a Wednesday or a Sunday privately, if that's what it's all about, then they're not really doing their job. I think we also need to be reminded that I've had conversations with people where they say, but the church around the corner from me, it does great work with the homeless. And I say, fantastic. But charities that are secular are also doing that, but they're not churches. So yes, a church needs to do all that fantastic work in the community. Many of them are doing that. That's not the issue. The issue is it there to stand up for the values of the Bible about how we ought to live, how we ought to know God? That's the issue.
Absolutely, and I think that sums up the entire programme, so thank you so much for that, Robert. And Tim, can you give maybe our viewers some practical advice about how they can stand in this gap? Because as we move towards an increasingly extreme secular age, we know that our ancient biblical beliefs are being trampled upon, that it was a Christian country, and if we don't speak up, we will completely lose it, particularly in a generation. So what practical ways would you advise our viewers to speak up, and also for our churches to speak up on issues like abortion and euthanasia, issues that are so central to the morality of today?
Well, I think it's very, very important, Simon, that we do talk about these issues. I think it's very important for churches to tackle these issues where gospel values, Christian values, biblical values are under attack. If you don't talk about them in church, then your church members will just be taught by the culture and accept the culture's views on these various things. And so I think it's very important indeed for churches to teach regularly on critical issues, ethical issues, moral issues, sexual morality, end of life, beginning of life morality, all these various things need to be taught about, need to be discussed, needs to be very clear, because it is black and white in the Bible, these various things, and explain it and show people why it is and articulate it, so that then those Christians in their church members can go to their families, their colleagues at the school gate, the relatives, and say, actually, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it. So, and I think that's very important to do that, very significant to do that. You know, explain your belief, explain that it's important to you, but also explain why you believe it and what the reasons are and how it's good for society and how it's good for morality and, you know, benefits people, family benefits people, all these kind of things. It's very important to explain that and to say people should have the freedom to do this.
Robert, I get asked this question a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, is that why as Christians should we get involved in politics? It's dirty, it's worldly, and we shouldn't have anything to do with it. But it's a matter of essentially life and death if we don't, and also the need to do it for the spiritual health of our nation, that as Christians, if we don't get involved, it could be disastrous, so within 30 seconds or so.
Well, I have friends who say exactly that. Why get involved? It's nothing to do with me. I'm not political. If we don't get involved in some way, even if it just means voting, contacting our MP about our concerns, our voice will never be heard. And then, of course, when they do public opinion polls, it will give the impression that the Christian voice is irrelevant because people have not made their voices known.
Absolutely. Tim, Robert, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's Politics Day, and thank you guys for what you are both doing in defending our Christian freedoms in this country. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. Yes, we are living an increasingly secular era, but it's important that the church and Christians in this country rediscover the role of the church, which is to be a conscience to the nation, and that we have to speak up on the big moral issues of the day, because if we don't, we surrender more and more territory to the enemy, we become more marginalised, we find that our influence is waning, and we don't see the power of God working in our nations, the churches that we should. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.